Hello, and welcome virtually to the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah E. Holliday from the library's events department, and I'm just here briefly to welcome you and our presenters. The library was founded in 1754 and is therefore celebrating our 270th anniversary this year with a special exhibition and related events, including this one. More events of all kinds are coming up, so please take a look at our website to learn more. We're grateful that today's event is generously sponsored by Polymath Educational Services, providing personalized support for teens with learning differences. 270 years ago, New York was a British colony, and the library was originally a British institution. So when the movement for independence began to rumble, you can be sure that our patrons had many strong opinions on all sides of the debate, and no doubt turned to our books for information and guidance. You can take a look at some of our earliest collections on our City Readers database. I've popped that link into the chat. Here to tell us more about that turbulent time are two of the leading scholars of the Loyalist movement in New York City, Dr. Sophie Jones and Dr. Christopher F. Minty. Dr. Jones is joining us today from Liverpool, where she's a lecturer in modern British history at the University of Liverpool. We've been honored to work with her in her research on libraries, reading communities, and cultural formation in the 18th century Atlantic, and she has been widely published on a range of topics, including loyalism, early modern merchant families, 18th century subscription libraries, and early modern literacy. Dr. Minty is currently based at the University of Virginia, where he is managing editor at the Center for Digital Editing. His PhD comes from the University of Stirling in Scotland, and he was recently elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His recent book is Unfriendly to Liberty: Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City, and you can purchase your copy from our friends at the Independent Corner Bookstore. That link is also in the chat. It's my pleasure to hand the virtual stage to Christopher Minty and Sophie Jones. Thank you. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting us to talk today. This is really a great opportunity to talk shop with Sophie about our research. What I'm going to do first is talk for about 5 to 7 minutes about my work and try and really condense what I put forward in my book into a brief, very brief presentation. So in the book and in my research, I wanted to explore the coming of the American Revolution in New York City. And New York City at that time was primarily Manhattan up to about 42nd Street, where the New York Public Library is. So it was a small, condensed space where people saw each other and engaged with each other on a day-to-day basis. And when I was starting this project, I was presented with a problem sort of right off the bat. It's like, if people are always with each other, if they see each other in the street, if they go to a coffee house or a tavern, they're not writing each other letters. That's the bread and butter of historians. People often think about John and Abigail Adams as correspondence and how wonderful it is, based at the Massachusetts Historical Society. But if people are with each other, there's no need to write to one another. So how was I going to examine loyalists and loyalism in and around New York City and Manhattan during the revolutionary period? So when I started this project, I started, so to speak, at the end. By the end, I mean I had identified people who were loyalists in and around New York, and then I wanted to work backward. So I found loyalist oaths of allegiance, petitions, and declarations, basically anything where someone, a New Yorker, put their name to a piece of paper declaring or identifying themselves as a loyalist. So I found loyalist declarations that were left quite literally on taverns for days at a time. I found petitions or declarations that were printed in New York's newspapers, and I found oaths of allegiance that were compiled in New York and then sent across the Atlantic to basically prove how loyal New Yorkers were. Because that was something that I also confronted early on, was that New York was a loyalist hotbed. It was a hotbed of loyalist activity, and there were more loyalists in New York than anywhere else. So I wanted to explore this. Like, was this true? Like, were there more loyalists in New York than anywhere else? Who were they? Often when people talk about loyalists, they talk about the capital L, the capital Loyalists, the Loyalists. And I wanted to examine the origins of their loyalism. Why did they become loyalists? And when I started to look at literature, sort of the historiography, when you start a project, you see that New Yorkers were moderate, they were reluctant revolutionaries, as Joseph Tiedemann argued. They were sort of behind, a few steps behind people in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. They weren't as radical as someone like Samuel Adams or John Dickinson or folks in Virginia like Patrick Henry. They weren't on the same level as them. And that image that New York was moderate has often been associated with people's loyalism. There were more loyalists in New York than anywhere else. And I wanted to say, was this true? So I went back, so the historian does, to some of the sources, and then wanted to find someone who had a lot of opinions, who there were a lot of material available. So I went to John Adams. Now, John Adams kept a diary when he was traveling down to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. He spent more time in New York than anywhere else. And during that time, he met some of the leading political figures in the city. And they kind of showed him off. They showed him off, they showed Samuel Adams off and the other Massachusetts delegates because they wanted to form sort of a political connection with them, build intercolonial relations that could take effect at the Continental Congress. So Adams in 1774 had an awareness of what was going on in Manhattan. He understood who the key figures were, he understood their politics, and he knew about their activism during the 1760s and early 1770s. They were against Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. They were against the Stamp Act, they protested violently, they were against the Townshend duties, they were against the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts. So here, what you see on the screen, two quotes from John Adams in the same letter that he's writing to his former law clerk, William Tudor. It's like, what is the reason that New York is still asleep or dead in politics and war? Must it always be so? And then he sort of speculates about there was some sort of atmospheric change happening in the city. There might have been something in the air or in the soil that was unfriendly to the spirit of liberty. There was something that the people were breathing or the people were eating that was affecting their mobilization behind the cause against Parliament, Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. What Adams was really concerned about was loyalists and loyalism. He was concerned that that was going to upend the natural order of things in the city, and they were going to take control and work against him and his associates. And the people he was concerned about are a family and faction known as the Delanceys. The Delanceys were identified to him early on as the people who were against intercolonial cooperation. They were against the Continental Congress. Fast forward a few hundred years, the Delanceys are often presented as Tories, sort of capital T Tories. They've often been portrayed as self-interested, as opportunistic, as people who only sought to advance themselves at the expense of other New Yorkers. And that sort of description has often been assigned to loyalists more broadly. And then you have this sort of stereotypical image that they were rich, that they were elite, that they didn't care about the ordinary New Yorker or the ordinary person. But what I argue in my book is that nobody was destined to become a loyalist or revolutionary in 1765, 1766, 1767, and so on. People in New York throughout the imperial crisis, people who became loyalists, people who became patriots, shared similar, if not the same, views on Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. They were against it. They were against it. What people don't often realize is that people who became loyalists were active in their opposition to Parliament. Now, I imagine everybody here is familiar with the Sons of Liberty or the Liberty Boys. What you might not be familiar with is that people who became loyalists in New York were active members and leading members in the Sons of Liberty. So here, I fast forwarded to this slide a little Well, a second ago, too fast. But here we have Delancey's as Sons of Liberty. So Joseph Alacoque, Edward Nicol were leading Delancey figures throughout the imperial crisis and into the revolution. They became very prominent loyalists. They signed the loyalist documents that I mentioned earlier. Then you'll see Isaac Sears and John Lamb, and you'll say, oh, hold on, they became patriots. Well, they did, but during the 1760s, they were prominent supporters of the Delanceys. They helped them get elected to the General Assembly. They mobilized support to them before eventually breaking away. Now you'll see the screenshot here. That's from Wikipedia. That's Wikipedia's list of prominent Sons of Liberty in New York. And you'll see Joseph Alacoque there, top of the list. Doesn't mention that he became a loyalist. And he had to flee New York because he was concerned with his safety. He thought he was going to be physically attacked. So he went to Antigua during the revolution. You'll also see Hercules Mulligan there. Mulligan took the oath of allegiance in Manhattan when he was there during the revolution. Does that make him a loyalist? Perhaps that's something we can talk about later. Now, James Delancey was the leading figure of this party, this faction, and he was also a prominent member of the Sons of Liberty. About a week after the Stamp Act was meant to be implemented, he wrote this letter to the Marquis of Rockingham, who was not then Prime Minister. He had not then repealed the Stamp Act. But he says, what say you to an American Parliament only to meddle with supplies? So here he is in 1765 suggesting to Rockingham the formation of an American Parliament. Other people would do this later on, much later on. But here we are 10 years before Lexington and Concord, or about 10 years. And he's suggesting seriously the formation of an American Parliament. Your colonies will exhaust you. Then if we fast forward 10 years, we have other members of the Delanceys talking about the relationship with Parliament and the colonies and with New York. Here's Frederick Rhinelander in 1775 saying the right of Parliament to tax this country, I need not tell you we all disapprove of, but the arbitrary and unjust resolves of Congress, the Continental Congress, I must tell you, we, the Protestants, detest. Another quote from Rhinelander. We have a small political club selected from the old Amicable Society. That's a political group. Many Delanceys, many people who became Loyalists were in that group. Our highest wish is a speedy reconciliation. If this province ever fights, it will be for the king. We must enlarge the club and meet frequent, he means frequently, during the assembly sessions so that we may be the better enabled to counteract the blues. These are the people who are working with John Adams. A quote from William Late, another Loyalist, another member of the Delancey group. I cannot with some allow the Parliament every power, for it does not to me seem reasonable that the internal regulation of this country, and both with respect to taxation and police, should be within their jurisdiction. Against Parliament's reorientation, the British Empire. William Late again. Our Assembly have pretty nearly pursued what you recommended. They have not adopted the proceedings of Congress, but have proceeded on their own bottom. So the New York Assembly, which the Delanceys are controlling at that point, they didn't adopt the proceedings of the Continental Congress. They wanted to protest themselves. William Late is fully supportive of that. So that I'll stop it there, and I'll hand everything over to Sophie. I think I went a little bit over time, but
that's okay. Thank you, Chris. That was brilliant. Let me now try and select share my screen. Okay. Brilliant. Okay. So thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us today, and thank you, Zaya, for arranging this event. So I'm Dr. Sophie Jones. I'm a lecturer in modern British history at the University of Liverpool. Do not let that title fool you. I very much work on the British Atlantic in the 18th century and primarily on North America, which I argued at my job interview was very much part of British history in the 18th century. So my current book project that's about to go to the publisher is based on my doctoral research that I completed at and that was in part funded by the University of Liverpool. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the United Empire Loyalists Association of Canada, who supported me financially through their Loyalist Scholar Programme. So my work's primarily an assessment of the compensation claims that were submitted by the American Loyalists, as they became known, to the Post-War Loyalist Claims Commission. This was a 5-member panel appointed in London in 1783, and its purpose was to inquire into the losses and services of those who suffered in their rights, properties, and professions during the late unhappy dissensions in America, in consequence of their loyalty to His Majesty and their attachment to the British government. Now, the commissioners eventually presided over more than 3,000 claims for compensation, and they realised quite early on that there were considerable differences in the actions taken by loyalists and the motivations for remaining loyal, and the responses to the American War for Independence that were captured in those financial claims. So Sir John Eardley Wilmot, who led the commission, noted that some people were loyal from their native attachment and what they thought their duty to their sovereign. Others were loyal on account of their official situations, like colonial administrators. But the commissioners noted that there were some who'd not been early in the part that they'd taken, and others who had switched sides. They'd at first taken part with the Americans. So what my research does, or tries to do, is explore these variations in loyalism. And the book looks closely at different examples of loyalism from across New York. So people like William Smith Jr., who I know the Society Library will be thinking about during this anniversary year as one of the library's co-founders, he demonstrated his loyalty to the British cause in a very different way to, for example, a tenant farmer living on the New York and Canadian frontier. Now, there's been almost 250 years of scholarship on the American Revolution. People essentially started writing histories of the conflict from 1781. And the data that I've got on the slide is actually taken from city readers. So books like the Abbé Raynal's Revolution in America and David Ramsey's History of the American Revolution were both held by the New York Library Society and quite popular. We know that people were reading them in the years following the American Revolution. But what's happened in the almost 250 years that have followed is that although contemporaries knew that there were lots of different behaviours that accounted for loyalism, scholars have distorted the meaning of that word slightly, and more often than not, they only consider those who fought for the British or people who were exiled as political refugees as being loyal. Now, this doesn't quite align with what people at the time on both sides of the Atlantic and on both sides of the conflict thought about loyalism. Now, I wanted to give you one example that's very close to me. It's about 15 minutes down the road from me. This is a memorial to Frederick Phillips III, the final Lord of Phillipsburg Manor in Westchester County. This memorial is in northwest England. It's in Chester Cathedral. And that's the city where Philip spent his final days as a political exile from the United States. And what we learn from this plaque is that Phillips was a gentleman, he was from New York, and that during the American Revolution, he risked his life to support the British Constitution and to oppose American independence. There's no mention of any military service, beyond the fact that in 1783, when the British evacuated the city, he left all of his property behind him and came to Chester. So my work explores these variations in loyalism, and New York is ideal for this. First of all, the 3,000 plus claims that were submitted to the British government, of those 3,000, about a third came from New York alone. And my research so far has shown that there were so many different types of loyalist behaviour that could be found within New York's different counties. But despite their differences, all of these people were deemed, or most of them, were deemed worthy of receiving financial compensation. At the same time, I also noticed that within different parts of New York, different groups of people made a decision whether or not to remain loyal and whether or not to take military action at different moments of the conflict and in very different circumstances to each other. So I have two tentative main arguments for the book. First, there was no single fixed definition of loyalism, and that a broad range of behaviours could in fact account for loyalism. And secondly, by looking at the different types of loyalist behaviours that emerged within different communities and different locations, it exposes to the extent to which loyalism was very much shaped by an individual's immediate context and local cultural norms. So I hope that gives you enough of a taster, and I look forward to talking about the project a little bit more.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Like, what I found like really interesting is that our source bases are similar and they overlap. Like, I used the loyalist claims, but only a little bit. And I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about the loyalist claims, because I admit I used them a little bit, but that my focus was primarily taking New Yorkers from 1760s up to when they signed a loyalist document, like Oath of Allegiance or a loyalist petition. So I looked at the claims just for context about, like, was this person as wealthy as they said they were? Where did they live? Things like that. But it seems that you've really sort of dug in.
Yeah. So at the start of my this arises from a PhD, and at the start of my PhD project, when I really wasn't that skilled at archival research, I basically spent a week at the National Archives with a trolley full of documents and just sort of picked, I think it was every fifth claim, photographed it. I have over 400. Obviously, they're now all digitized on Ancestry. So if anyone has access to Ancestry.com, you can look at them for free. Or if you've subscribed, you don't need to go to the National Archives. But my sense is that when scholars have tended to use the loyalist claims, they engage with individuals. So people are looking for specific people, which of course makes perfect sense.
That's what I did.
No, and that's absolutely, I've done that as well for certain people. I've wanted to go and have a dig around. But what I did was I just captured a really broad range of people from different counties, different communities within those counties, people of different ethnicities, and captured all this data on a massive spreadsheet, and then started to do some simple analysis of it. So the PhD itself, or my work itself, comes from a quantitative analysis. So I noticed that, for instance, and this is one of the ones that I really enjoy talking about, there were a disproportionate number of loyalists living in Tyrone County who happened to be Scottish, who, when I dug into it a bit more, were very likely to be Highlanders. And that's sort of where I've started to follow that thread. And so these people who, you know, we only have fragments of their lives, they've been otherwise very difficult to trace, but unraveling that thread and thinking, well, why are they there and why did they take this side? And actually they acted in a very, very different way to someone who lives in this particular county. So it's very much a study of ordinary people that you might know if they're one of your ancestors, but you possibly wouldn't stumble across them in a textbook. And I really enjoy that side of it.
Because, like, when I was working on this, like, my book evolved out of my PhD, like my dissertation. And when when I started work on that, like I did this very like broad collective biography of loyalists, and that was like the centerpiece of my dissertation. And the stuff about what happened in Manhattan beforehand, it wasn't an afterthought, but it was secondary to that. And I was encouraged to go in that direction by my advisors, by my committee, and that was fine. And that's how I came across all of these sources, because the claims they were like, when you go through graduate school, sometimes they were kind of held up as like, these are useful sources. However, they're totally like, people wanted to get money back, so of course they're going to exaggerate. And then that people start to question their accuracy, and are they just making things up? But now, having like revised, like the book is, I rewrote every chapter, I had to write new ones, and what was the centerpiece of my dissertation is now in a short appendix at the end. And I had to dive more thoroughly into the sources that I used. And I was finding people who were signing these oaths of allegiance, taking the oath of allegiance, signing these documents, who, like, they're not loyalists. Like, I found an oath of allegiance on Long Island, and thousands of people took the oath of allegiance there after the British reoccupied New York, and they were members of the Culper Spy Ring. So spies for revolutionary forces took the oath of allegiance, and it's like, are these people loyalists? And then looking at the one in Manhattan, I mentioned Hercules Mulligan. He took the oath of allegiance. He wasn't a loyalist. And then Peter Vanbrugh Livingston Jr., son of Senior, who was a prominent revolutionary or patriot. Peter Vanbrugh Livingston Jr. also took the oath of allegiance. And then that got me thinking about the sources that I used when I first did my dissertation. I was like, well, they might be more problematic, because you have people who are almost certainly not loyalists, but here they are taking the oath of allegiance, which, if you just look at it on paper, which is what I did, you're like, well, they're loyalists because they did this. I was like, well, are they though? Because they're doing it. It's like what you said, their local situation. Maybe it's a simplification to say they did what they had to do to get by. But if you're a Long Island farmer or a carpenter or whatever, and you have the world's largest army on your doorstep, literally outside, with the royal governor of New York, and you're like, you have to take this oath of allegiance, or not only we're going to rough you up, we might arrest you and make life very difficult for you. But it's just interesting, like I've completely changed my view of the compensation claims. And like, I've been working on this project for like 15 years, like a 15-year period. And now I think I really appreciate the value in them, because the sources that I use, I've just started to really pick apart. And like, it's like, this is like, what do you think about like what is a loyalist? And
So when I was I mean, they have quite a few limitations, especially in terms that they're not representative. So there are a few. We know there are a few loyalists who weren't English, weren't of European ancestry. And my sense is those people weren't supposed to be eligible to go down that route, but they were. You know, if you've got someone who was enslaved, who's then free by the time of the war, I think from my back catalogues in my head, he was a shoemaker. So he claimed for all his leather supplies that went missing. And I don't think the British expected him to put that claim in. But I've got 3 examples. We know there was so many more that don't go down that route. And it just so happened when I just started working on the project, I was working in the financial services. That's my background. And before this, and I was working on compensation claims. And I was reading them with the same kind of, yeah, but did you? I had a similar thought about, and when you hear of the farmer in Albany County who goes and enlists with his 5 sons and they don't all come back, and then you've got somebody perhaps in New York City who's doing quite a performative version of loyalism where they don't actually seem to do anything, but they can write 10 pages about why they are so loyal and why they deserve a really significant payout. I think, really? I don't know. How are these comparable? But that's the commissioner's job. But I wanted to ask about the oaths and that kind of performative aspect, because could you talk a little bit about a little bit more about how they work? Because presumably, if you were, let's say, pragmatic, you could take the oath to the king and send that across the Atlantic, and not many people would see that. And then, you
Yeah.
know, sign the Articles of Association and sort of sign for both sides.
Yeah, so like my work like is about people who became loyalists, but the book is really just as much about people who became patriots or revolutionaries because it explores the origins of the revolution. But I looked at it through the perspective of people who became loyalists because usually with most history books, people have this nice neat 10-year organization to take people toward the revolution. So you start with Stamp Act and then hop onto the Townsend duties. Then maybe you might just touch on the Boston Massacre, and then you'll keep going again, the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts, and then, oh, you're at Lexington and Concord already. I wanted to just look at people, follow that same trajectory, and then take them toward loyalism. So all of the documents that I have started to appear 1775. So the first one I found was a newspaper petition. It was published in one of the newspapers from Westchester. The first name on the list is Frederick Phillips, coincidentally. And then I started to dig a little deeper as we start to go further. The revolution hadn't started then, to the Oath of Allegiance. And the way it was organized is that the Royal Governor, William Tryon, and the British Army would tender the Oath of Allegiance to people. And oftentimes there was a slip of paper, which maybe no bigger than that, wasn't that big. There's one on display at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. I think it's from Long Island. And people would sign their name to it. And that was it. It was similar to signing the Continental Association. And if you were a Quaker, you would affirm, you do something a little different. And then a clerk would take all of the names and then transcribe them into a big document, one after the other, alphabetically. Sometimes there might be their age, they might have their occupation. If it was for a place like Long Island, it was divided up by town, which is helpful for comparative analysis. And then that would get shipped. That would be like an enclosure in a letter from Tryon to George Germain, who was in charge of overseeing the colonies at this point, as like evidence of, look how loyalist New York is. Look how many loyalists there are. And that was it. And people, they wouldn't know. Like, there's no further evidence. You might have your slip of paper, but you could burn it. Because I haven't found too many of the individual pieces of paper that people signed their names to. And that was it. So I think people just were like, okay, let's do this to get by. Because I don't want the British Army roughing me up or making my life difficult, or I'm a spy, I live in Manhattan, so I'm going to have to do this. They adjusted to their circumstance, and then they put together these, I mean, they're lovely documents because they're very beautifully written, they're very ornate. There is like a performative aspect to it because this is the Royal Governor of New York trying to like make himself look better to his superiors in Britain. Like, I'm doing a good job, so this will eventually put me up the ladder. Look how many loyalists there are. New York is the hotbed of loyalism, and these documents and these people, they're not all filled with New Yorkers at this point. Because when we get into like 1777, which is when The one from Manhattan is people are leaving other places. They're leaving places like Virginia to go to New York to seek refuge and protection. So these aren't New York loyalists, although they signed a document in New York. These are loyalists from other places, which makes exploring their backgrounds quite challenging because I would go to them first in the first instance and think they were all New Yorkers, and I'm like, there's nothing for this guy in New York. He lives in Virginia, and it just complicates things, but it makes you appreciate like people went to New York because it was the center of the British headquarters during the Revolution, or most of the Revolution. So you have to be really, I don't want to say suspicious, but you have to really be quite critical of every document that you look at. And when I first started doing this research, I don't think I was critical enough.
I think that's something that that I didn't quite anticipate when looking at this. When I first started looking at this period, is how mobile people are in an era where transport is limited and it's expensive and it's difficult and complex. How people move from place to place quite readily, and it's something I've noticed with the project I was working on for the last few years, the libraries project. We find library members popping up at other libraries in other places, and it's quite I really empathize with that, untangling people and trying to work out exactly people where they suddenly just seem to appear in New York in a certain year.
And I actually kind of got to sidestep that issue a little bit because the book really focuses on a comparatively small group of people who are active in local politics and local cultural and social life and follow their behavior during the revolution. So I don't start in 1765 because everybody was against the Stamp Act and I didn't have anything really to say there. I start in 1768, which is when there were assembly elections in New York, and I track a group of people and how they came together in 68 and they reinforced their connections throughout the imperial crisis. But what led me to that was like piecing these people together was from these later documents, the Loyalist petitions and oaths, because I was trying to identify as many people as I could. So I would go to Albany because nothing was digitized then. So I spent, because I'd studied in Scotland, I would come over to Albany pretty much every winter. And like, we don't get that much snow in the UK. So it was pretty brutal. I would turn up, I would look like the Michelin man in my big winter jacket, and I would walk down to the state archives and look at probate records and land records. And I was going through all of them, making as many scans as I could of loyalists who took the oath of allegiance or signed something. And I wanted to find out their real wealth, their personal wealth, if they bought any land or anything like that. And as I was going through them, and I was trying to go through it pretty fast, so I wasn't reading every single one, but I was noticing the same people who were loyalists, the same names kept popping up, and that they were like cross-referencing each other. So if someone's would have I'd read their will, and then their witness or their executor might be just some other loyalist who took the oath of allegiance. I'm like, that's interesting. And then it kept on happening. And it kept on happening. And then I found that people who signed loyalist documents in the early 1770s started buying land together. They started buying vessels together. I'm like, this is really weird. All these names are popping up. So, and that's when I went to the loyalist claims, because the loyalists who I studied who left, they were witnesses to each other, and they offered like supporting statements to verify someone's loyalism. It's like, this is more than a coincidence. So that's when, so it was putting these pieces together that led me to go back to the imperial crisis. So 1768 is when the election is. That's when the Delancey folks who I study put themselves up for election. And thankfully, the poll books for that election and the 69 election they were published in the 19th century. So, and you can see who all voted, and you can see who everybody voted for. So I went and had a look at that, and people who became loyalists voted for the Delancey candidates. And I was like, huh, look at that. 69, there were more. And it's the same people voting for the same people. And then in 1770, things are a bit stressful in New York at this time because there's two big groups. One is led by the Delanceys and one is led by Alexander McDougall. And they're both calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, which is a bit confusing. And they both want to commemorate the repeal of the Stamp Act, but they don't want to celebrate together because they don't like each other. So they have separate events in different taverns or different pubs. And the Delancey folks publish the list of names who go to theirs. And it's the same people again. And I'm like, there's more, there's something here. And I'm doing this. And so I'm in graduate school and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, I need to explore this. And I didn't really have the opportunity to with my dissertation, but because the publisher, they didn't really want to go with this really detailed quantitative analysis as the book. They were like, yeah, just explore that further. So that's what I did. And I was like, these people started to form connections in the late 1760s. They reinforced them initially through politics, but then they started to business ventures, commercial ventures, and then they started intermarrying. Ha! Look at this. And then it comes to like 1775, partisanship is so bad in New York that they've drawn their line in the sand. They don't like each other, and that's what leads people to kind of stick together. So that's like I sidestepped the issues of like what is a loyalist a little bit because I focused on these people who sign these documents together, and then I was able to like connect the dots. And there's that meme from Parks and Rec floating around with the guy with the board. That's what I felt like connecting all of these people. And I was like, and I was trying to keep it all up with post-it notes, and I eventually did some social network stuff because they were coming into each other's shops as well. And I'm like, this, and that's what I ran with. And it was just, so I took people from when they were loyalists and just tracked backward. But the document issue is one that I was grateful to sidestep just a little bit. Although I do love talking about it because it is so interesting.
Well, that's given me something to think about. So something I initially wanted to do was similarly when you made a compensation claim, you had to produce witnesses, and it was the same names. So, and I don't know how to do social network analysis yet. I will do, and when I do, I'm going to run all those names, but it would be interesting to see if they're the same or at least overlaps.
Like the Delancey folks who left, like James, who is the main figure, he travels to Britain in 1775 because he wants to protest in person, and because he knows Rockingham and he knows Edmund Burke, because there's not that many papers from around that period that he writes or receives, but my thinking is that he wanted to essentially protest with them or with them sort of behind him. But by the time he leaves, things have moved on. So he never comes back. When he submits his claim for a lot of money, it's his friends who are his witnesses. And Oliver is the same. He's slightly different because he serves in the military and in a loyalist regiment. And what was a little like I was never able to explore it fully is someone like Rhinelander, who I showed a quote of in late, become members of the Society Library. They stay in New York, and like they sort of adjust back into their lives. Rhinelander becomes super prominent. When he dies in the 1800s, there are lots of death notices or obituaries published in the press. They don't mention his loyalism. And like I worked for the papers of George Washington, and so using the Washington papers, and Rhinelander is identified by Washington as he's like a notorious Tory, and he's in Jersey at this time because it's before the British came. Like 30 years later, he's living the life, socializing with the Astors, and like people don't remember his loyalism. He's a member of the Society Library. It was interesting to me.
Yeah, that's something I've never been able to untangle. because I haven't had the chance, is how some people are able to just drift back into society like nothing's changed, and other people are so tainted by loyalism
Yeah,
that there's absolutely no way that they can.
because during the war, there's the Act of Attainder that confiscates all of some loyalist estates, and if they're effectively banished, and if they're caught, they would be executed. And James Delancey is among that, and there are other, and I think Frederick Phillips might be on it as well with his wife.
Yeah,
And it's pretty tough for them. And like Phillips takes the oath of allegiance, and then there's a wonderful, or it's quite a sad really, description of him leaving. And apparently he was extremely emotional, like upset that he had to leave. And for him, there was really no turning back. And for Delancey, I don't think there was any turning back. But for Rhinelander and Late, and probably numerous others, they were able to adjust to their new life. And people, I don't know if we won't know if people forgot because they're with each other, but it seems that they were just able to build new lives. And then after enough time had passed, they were just, like Rhinelander became super rich. Or not, maybe not super rich, but wealthy enough, or wealthier than you might expect. But that is something that I would love someone else to explore.
yeah.
It's not going to be me. It's not going to be me. One thing I wanted to ask you is that because like my research is pretty narrow, and like you focused on a larger geographic area,
Yeah.
and then that's really interesting to me about like what differences there might have been or any comparisons. Like I'm interested to hear more about that.
So I'm interested in ethnicity as well, and how ethnicity might shape loyalism, because quite frankly, for anyone who isn't aware, a lot of the Scottish Highlanders that end up living in New York do so because they've been systematically oppressed by the British, and really, I mean the English, who have essentially driven them out and destroyed their communities.
Yeah,
So
I'm trying not to laugh as a Scot here.
why? I know. I'm being cautious. So why on earth did those people fight for the British?
Mm-hmm.
And my sense with them very much is because they become allied with Sir William Johnson and
Yeah.
Sir William Johnson's descendants. So the Johnsons more broadly, who, as colonial administrators and as opponents of the Continental Congress, very, very early on, in 1775, so before the Declaration of Independence, have already staked their claim to which side they're on. So all of their Scottish tenants, I argue, who pledge their allegiance to them and are protected by them, and who face a hostile American-born local community, they're kind of swept along in it. They're ferociously loyal.
Yeah.
They do really, can I say fantastic? But they really throw themselves into the cause.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think any of that's to do with the king. I just don't. I'm also curious about. I think this would be me. So in Albany, people that just hope that the war might pass them by. They might not have to do anything. And then their neighbours start snitching on them, and they get pulled before these committees and basically told to take the oath of allegiance and renounce their allegiance to the king, and conscience comes into play. And I think that decision's on a knife edge. It can go either way. And I don't know if those people are really loyal or they're being forced into it.
Yeah. Because
But a
some
lot of those
loyalists had a
people,
really tough time. And
yeah,
people, because there was a mine in Connecticut, the Simsbury mines, and if you didn't, go along, renounce allegiance to George III, sign the Continental Association, you were put down that mine, and there is I think it might be a compensation thing, but it's always stuck with me because the person says that they were kept below ground for months at a time. And the quote that sticks in my mind is that they didn't see the sun. And I'm like, whoa, that must have been tough. And like if that happens to someone, that sets a precedent, so that will influence how others behaved. And people were forced to go along on both sides. It wasn't just the people who were revolutionaries or patriots. The British did it too. But I remember James Rivington, who's a printer, his printing press was destroyed by Isaac Sears and kind of his motley crew because they didn't like what he was publishing. So they were kind of eradicating not a free press, but the press they didn't like.
Yeah.
And there was a loyalist called Christopher Billop. I think it's Billop. And it's in the Mackenzie papers at the Clements Library, there's a memorial that he talks about where he's standing outside his house with a big sword in his hand, and people are throwing rocks at him because he's a loyalist, or a Tory, as they said. And I remember he writes about one hit him like right between the eyes. And there was a lot of physical abuse on both sides. And that, if you see that, if I saw that, I'd be like, oh, I don't want to get battered. So it was difficult. Local circumstances really affected things, but it's so hard to effectively document, like the good historian we all aspire to be, because not everybody wrote things down, things didn't survive. It was a turbulent time, and it shows you the complexities of allegiance and identity that I work to sort of unpack in my work, and I struggle to do it in my book. And it's just something that I feel that we're always working to get a handle on.
Yeah. I mean, some of the stories, I understand that sometimes claims can be elaborated, and the sort of estimates of people's accounts and their properties can be inflated. But some of the stories in there are quite harrowing. Lots of violence on women as well, which I think is something that needs to be studied. You know, certain things about women had only recently given birth and were recovering, being dragged out of bed in the night, and this, you know, things that were abhorrent in those societies. And again, what does that have to do with what does that have to do with the imperial dispute? You know, people being harassed and dragged into disputes. But I also think at the same time I was writing the PhD, it was sort of the Brexit vote was happening in Britain, which was not on the same level, but was very divisive in its own way. And it was something that shaped how I was viewing these sources as well. And, you know, these tensions that sort of escalated and got really, really nasty and really bitter. But yeah.
Because you can see what's happening. This is a real divergence, but what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, and the way that people are forced to take sides. It's different situation, different context, but the way that people are forced to make a decision is somewhat similar. And what's interesting about the sources that I primarily worked from is that there were no women. They weren't allowed to take the oath of allegiance. They didn't sign any of the loyalist petitions that I have, and I had to deal with that as best I could, like explain why. And it's not something that I never fully got a good handle on. And it's something that I feel is a weakness of those sources and in my work, because I wasn't able to explore it fully.
Is that to do with couverture and the idea that women don't have political agency?
Yeah, I think so.
Because that's what tends to happen, especially in Albany, when men have gone off to fight. The committees harass the wives and say, you need to leave, you need to go to New York City. And if her neighbours put in a petition and said, well, Jane's been very well behaved, we're happy for her to live here, usually they could stay. Sometimes they couldn't. And there didn't seem to be a process as to how those decisions were made. They're not captured. We just have the decision. But if you can wait for me to write the chapter and write the book,
Yeah,
so where women doing fantastic things, you know, women acting as spies, carrying, well, maybe not fantastic, but really daring and dangerous things, going on to military ships and ships where the governor was hiding and carrying information over and risking their lives, but also their reputations.
yeah,
These weren't places that gentlewomen were supposed to be going. So
yeah. I think I'm conscious of time and for
yeah,
Q&A, but I think that's a perfect point to pause. And if we invite Sarah back in, maybe that Sophie and I can try to answer some questions. And if I can't, so Sophie definitely can.
Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. And I just love how much it tells us about political history, obviously, but also just about human nature, you know, the scale on which
Yeah,
people are able to think or analyze their situation. Like they're thinking about country and empire, but they're also thinking about self and family, including like right now, is this going to be useful for me? You know, next week, am I going to be able to eat? Like, and how decisions are made on those different scales, which obviously is the case throughout history, as you point out. Um, so I do have a couple of questions here, and happy to have you add other points if you'd like to. Audience members, anything you'd like to ask, feel free to drop into the chat on YouTube. So small scale thing, when we saw the slide about, I think, Frederick Rhinelander, he said something about we the Protestants feel this
yeah.
way. Who was he contrasting himself to?
He they tried. They attacked their opponents sometimes based on their religious affiliation. So a lot of their opponents were Presbyterian. Alexander McDougall, Presbyterian, so he attacked him that way. And it didn't. I explored religion a little bit, and I didn't really see too much of an like a differentiator. Like there were many loyalists who were Anglican. There were many loyalists who were Presbyterian. Not as many, but the source base that I worked off was tilted heavily in favor of Anglicans. But that was something that they referred to their opponents as the Blues,
Oh,
which is another way to refer to it as Presbyterians. And that was just Rhinelander did that, and he was writing to an Anglican minister. So that's how, and the Anglican minister is John Vardell. John Vardell, where I found that was in the National Archives in a box that Vardell submitted as evidence of his loyalism. I think it's an AO13-105 because it was just a big box and a pile of papers in it, and it, they weren't wonderfully preserved. Like you open the box and they're just piled up. That he's writing for, I think, for his audience, but that's how I would like to explore it further because I know some historians say the American Revolution was a religious war, and Anglican ministers definitely said that, but most people, I don't think, interpreted it that way.
that is just interesting to me because there's a dispute between competing groups of what I would say were Protestants, because to me, contemporary view Presbyterians are Protestants in
Yeah,
the sense of, you know, not Roman Catholics, etc. But early in the library's history, and it's not worth going into detail on that, and I would have to look it up anyway, but where people are saying, you know, the real people and what they mean are the Anglicans as opposed to
yeah.
those other guys. And so I don't
That
know
it
how
was kind
that's,
of like an ongoing thing throughout the imperial crisis, especially in New York, because some Presbyterians thought that Anglicans wanted to set up an American bishop and they would take away everyone's religious liberties, and they attacked the Delanceys on that because many of the Delanceys were originally Huguenots, French Huguenots, and they converted to Anglicanism, and they said that they're going to take away your religious liberties. And the Delanceys this was a big thing in the 69 election, they didn't really engage with it. Anglican ministers did. So it was just these people sort of talking to each other. And I know that was a really big factor in setting up King's College, so now Columbia. Um, but a lot of the time it was Anglican ministers talking with people like William Livingston or William Smith Jr. or John Moore Scott, rather than James Delancey, James Delancey Jr., him and the folks that I study.
yeah.
well, that's to put my other hat on with my other project. That part of the reason why the Society Library was founded was because there was some concern about the Anglican influence at King's, and it was set up, the advert for subscribers said, well, this library is going to support the college, which is King's. So it was set up that it wouldn't, and there's all these sort of ideas about the Anglicans trying to manipulate and gain control of the committee, and they'll be able to choose all the books. But I thought I picked up on that as well, because those Scottish Highlanders that I keep talking about, the charge was made that they were Catholics and that they were Jacobites. And that's drawing on that argument was out of date in the 1770s. But I noticed that. I thought, oh, that's interesting, because there's this idea that the Loyalists are also sometimes Catholics and tyrannical Catholics as well.
Yeah, in 1765, when Cadwallader Colden, who's another Scot, he's lieutenant governor, and he's acting governor at that time. And when the riots happen, they burn him in effigy and they dress him up as a Jacobite drummer, sort of inferring that he's very old. He'd been serving since the 1720s, and so they inferred that he had participated in the 1715 Jacobite uprising, which was 50 years ago, but he didn't. But they like to attack him that way. What is interesting, so that a good instance of Scotophobia there. What is interesting is that Alexander MacDougall was Scottish, and he didn't really get that. He was Presbyterian, but he didn't really get any attacks because he was a Scot. People loved him in New York, especially after 1770.
That is really, it's so interesting how, because obviously the division between Jacobites, I mean, that imposing the fault lines that are going on in British society onto other fault lines that are happening in colonial society, and how they map and don't map onto each other. It's a whole thing of its own. Yeah. So you talked some about, I mean, the documentation, lists and things people signed and so forth. I'm sure there were many articles and broadsides and all kinds of ephemera thinking about the Loyalist cause. Like, what's the philosophy here? What is our orientation here? What about books? Sophie, can you speak to, were people publishing apologies for loyalism, or was that not really happening?
So it's not something I've been able to dig into as much as I would have liked. But in terms of the patriotism and the call for independence has quite a clear goal. The Loyalists, I think one of the things that's difficult about loyalism is there isn't a clear end goal. It's just not independence, but it could be, maintaining the status quo. It could also mean remaining part of the empire, but then having significant reform, which is arguably what William Smith goes on to do in Canada and shape the way that Canada starts to evolve as a British colony. There's pamphlet wars, certainly, where Charles Inglis is a big proponent of that, where people start to respond to things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense and start to attack it. So there's definitely pamphlet wars and things like that. There's lots of books being printed around this time about the state of Britain and the state of its colonies, and it's the state of the empire. But that is something that I would really like to unpack further, with sort of both my hats on from two different projects. But yeah, those books exist, but there's no sort of clear Loyalist manifesto in the same way that there's Common Sense, but there are certainly responses to it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's like there's little dribs and drabs, but there's no cohesive end goal. How are they going to return to colonial society? What's the setup going to be? And that's one of the reasons that Loyalists, or leading Loyalists and British figures, are criticized, is that there's no real leader and there's no real coherent goal here, except suppressing what's going on. And that when James Delancey travels to Britain, I think he's trying to perhaps sets something up but doesn't really gain any traction. And by the time Britain sort of gets its act together and starts offering concessions, the Americans are fully committed, and it's like, no, it's independence or nothing. We're going to fight for it. So they're kind of like Macbeth, like they've gone so far, they're going to keep going, and it's like they can't turn around now. And it works out well for them, and loyalists never really sort of get their act together in that sense.
I think to complicate the picture as well, when I was looking for books that have been published about the American conflict, as it in that period, there are books that are being published in Britain that essentially say this is why we need to let the North American colonies go, and it's no longer, that situation is no longer viable, and putting the argument forward to sort of look eastwards. And my sense from reading Loyalist diaries, where they come to, because they have to go to London to make those compensation claims, until the commission eventually said, actually, maybe we should go to Canada because that's where about 30,000 people are. When Loyalists come to Britain, there's not universal support for them. There's not universal support for the war. And it's really quite a culture shock, because there's sort of this sense that we're your fellow countrymen, we've been fighting because we all believe in the same thing. And then they get to England and people aren't very nice to them. Some are, some aren't. And there's a lot of homesickness, and it's really this collective shock that they've been fighting for things that people in Britain have either they're disinterested in because it doesn't affect them personally on a day-to-day. So yeah, there is also sort of that scholarship as well on, the future of the empire and what comes next, and all of that's being written while the war is still going on. So it's really complicated and multi-stranded.
And some loyalists expected to have the lives they had in New York in places like London. And when that didn't happen, they were like, oh, this isn't great. So like Isaac Lowe, who was a merchant and a loyalist, and at one point a delegate to the Continental Congress, he writes
and the library number.
Yep. He writes to his brother, Nicholas, who's back in New York, about how difficult he's finding it in London. And like many of them live near each other in London. And then to move beyond New York to Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, people sort of put him as like the leading loyalist in all of North America. He kind of expects to be treated similarly in London, and it doesn't happen. And it's like, because people are just like, who are you?
Yeah.
They hate the food, they hate the weather. There was one diary, the name escapes me, but he went to Liverpool and he hated it. And then he went to Manchester. He said, I can't understand anybody. He then went to Manchester and went, this is even worse. I don't know why Phillips ends up in Chester. Chester's kind of an old money society in the 18th century. It's also in decline because Liverpool eclipses it. They're very near each other. And they're competing for the same rivers. But there's also this sense of a few go to Dover because it reminds them of parts of Massachusetts and it deals with that homesickness. It's also really expensive, so they can't live the lives that they're accustomed to, and it's really sad. They're quite a difficult read sometimes because there's a lot of emotion in there. Yeah.
Like Miles Cooper bops around a little bit. Like he's in London, then he goes up to Oxford, and then he settles in Edinburgh, and that's where he dies. He dies in, I think, 1785, so he's not there for too long. But he settles there because of the academic life, like the Athens of the North. But a lot of people struggle. But Cooper, during the Revolution, he wanted to go back to New York. He didn't want to stay in Britain, and he was never able to. And I think a lot of loyalists had to deal with that. Like, we're not because that's their home, and like they're not able to go back to it, so they have to set up new lives that are never going to be quite the same.
Well, that sense of, in a way, they're refugees, like an expat community, but they expect it to be a repate community, like as though it's going to be more continuous, and it's actually more like immigrating, or that's, yeah.
People who move to the Maritimes, like New Brunswick or Halifax, like they have a sense of maybe a better sense of that, because they're in some ways like setting up a new community. They're the first ones there, and they do enjoy some success at first, but it's hard. It's hard to set up a new world somewhere.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll draw to a close there, unless there's anything, concluding thought you'd like to throw in, but I think we have learned a great deal.
I'm excited for your book, Sophie. It sounds great.
As are
Oh,
we.
thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Sophie Jones, Dr. Christopher Minty, for being with us today. Audience members, do take a look at the links in the chat. Many things coming up at the library, more about our anniversary, our exhibition. Also, you can buy Dr. Minty's book from our friends at the Corner Bookstore. And thank you so much for being with us.